Today is the second week of our new series, God's Promise, I Am With You. And throughout this fall, we're going to be looking at the many times that God makes this promise throughout Scripture. And we're going to be looking at what this promise means for us. This is God's central promise of the Bible. I will be with you. Last week, we talked about all the reminders God gives us of his promise, of his presence. Last week, we talked about all the reminders God gives us of his presence and how they're like Post-it notes that are placed throughout the Bible and throughout our own faith journey. That they just remind us, I am with you, I am with you, I am with you, again and again. And we talked about how we're invited to a with God life and how Jesus models that with God life for us and makes it available to us. In his book, God is Closer Than You Think, John Ortberg describes spiritual growth in this way. Spiritual growth, in a sense, is simply increasing our capacity to experience the presence of God. And he lifts up some foundational truths about the reality of God's presence with us in this book. And I shared them in the message last week, and you should now have them as a bulletin insert. Here, if you want to take those home with you and look at them. The suggestion is to look at them every day, read them through every day for 2 weeks, and then throughout our series to just come back at least once a week and look back through them. The thought is that we will let these kind of take hold of us and just seep in. And they're all very encouraging, so I think you will feel better if you read this list. Emily also sent electronic copies. She'll send it out by email. If you lose this paper or if you want to put it in more than one place, it should be in your emails. Maybe you want to add this to your quiet time or to your daily prayer to really let these truths soak in. So this morning we're going to be talking about the first time God makes this promise, I am with you, to Jacob. And we are going to consider the reality that God is with us even when we wander, even when we behave badly, even when we act like a scoundrel, lie and cheat, and steal our brother's birthright, even when we don't recognize that God is with us. Now, Jacob is a troubling character, and if I'm really honest with you, I've never really liked him, and even as I read the story again this week, I still don't like him. He is a schemer, he is a deceiver, he's such a jerk to his brother. Okay, so Jacob is the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham, but as we've already talked about this morning, he's not the only son of Isaac, right? He has this twin brother Esau, who was born first. And, even in the womb, the Bible tells us that these two wrestled and jostled about, and that Rebecca said, what's going on? And the Lord said, 2 nations are at war within you. So they're born, and as Emily pointed out, they're so very different. That Esau is this ruddy outdoorsman, and he is his father's favorite. And then Jacob is more of an indoor person. He is more delicate, and he is definitely his mother Rebecca's favorite. Again, as the eldest, Esau should have had the birthright. It was his right to the larger portion of the inheritance and to his father's blessing. But Jacob, with the help of his mother, tricks Esau and Isaac out of both of these. I mean, it's really quite a story, and if you want a very dramatic tale, you don't need a soap opera. You just need to read Genesis 25 to 35 and the story of the life of Jacob. I'm telling you. So when Esau finds out what Jacob's done, he's absolutely furious and he plans to kill him. So Rebekah learns of this and she convinces Isaac to send Jacob away to her family and her own. So now Jacob is a fugitive. He is fleeing for his life. He is somewhere between this conflict-ridden past and an uncertain future. And he finds himself alone in a completely unfamiliar place. And it is here, in this place of fear and uncertainty and loneliness, in this place of being aware that he has really done his brother wrong, he's really afraid for his life. It's here. in the midst of all of this, between this conflict and this uncertainty, that God meets him. So listen now to Genesis 28, verses 10 to 22. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. And your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob woke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid, and he said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put under his head, and he set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So Jacob stops for the night at no place in particular, because the sun has set and it is dark. And the Hebrew text really emphasizes that this is no place in particular. It's just a place to stop at the side of the road. It could have been Port Royal. It could have been Guam. He lays his head on a rock, ouch, and goes to sleep. I mean, really, that sounds like a terrible pillow, but this rock will come to mean a lot to Jacob. God meets him in a dream and gives him a vision of a ladder set up on earth and reaching to heaven, with angels going up and down. And this ladder has become quite famous. Probably you've seen at least one painting of it, maybe many, and heard at least one song about it, maybe many. A Stairway to Heaven. God comes near to Jacob and speaks to him and makes himself known and gives Jacob the same promise that he gave to Abraham and then expanded with Isaac when he added, I will be with you. We talked about that last week. Now God says to Jacob, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. So God makes an introduction. This is who I am. The God of Abraham and the God of Isaac. God of your ancestors. This is who I am. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. Remember, that promise of land has been part of the promise from the very beginning, clear back with Abraham. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. Again, that's been part of the promise from the beginning, that there will be descendants, offspring, as numerous as the stars. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. From the beginning, this blessing was not just for Abraham, not just for Isaac, not just for Jacob. It was a blessing for the nations through them. They are blessed to be a blessing. Know that I am with you. God's presence is there with Jacob. And I will keep you wherever you go. and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So in this last part, God is expanding the promise to Jacob, and sort of the promise given to Abraham, and then with Isaac he adds, I will be with you, and then with Jacob, he says, I'll keep you wherever you go. I'm going to look after you. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to protect you. I will bring you back to this land. There's a promise of return, of restoration. I will not leave you. Again, the promise of God's presence, of God's remaining, of God completing what he has begun. The God who began a good work in Jacob will be faithful to complete it. And this promise is not just for Jacob. This promise is that through Jacob and his family, as I said, all the families of the world will be blessed. And we who put our trust in Jesus Christ are grafted into this promise, says Paul. We become sons and daughters of Abraham. We become part of this covenant through Jesus Christ. And this promise becomes also for us. That we too are blessed to be a blessing, and that through us all the nations of the earth are to be blessed. As Jesus puts it, we are to be salt and light in the world. So we have this ladder. This is such a powerful image as Jacob's vision. Heaven and earth connecting, and angels ascending, going up, and descending, coming down, and God's presence there. The gate to heaven. An important thing to realize here, we've probably all sung, we are climbing Jacob's ladder, every rung grows higher and higher. But actually, the ladder is not about us getting to God. It's about God coming to us. That's what's happening in this vision. God is coming near to Jacob. God is revealing his presence to Jacob. God is showing, the theological term would be imminence, his nearness. God is right there where Jacob is. And he's giving him this vision to show God's presence and the closeness of heaven. In the first chapter of John, Jesus will actually connect himself with this image of Jacob's ladder. And he'll say, you'll see me as a ladder going up to heaven, and angels ascending and descending. So, in some ways, this ladder represents Jesus, which makes sense because we have all been taught Jesus is the way to God. He's the way and the truth and the light. Jesus is the ladder. He's what connects heaven with earth. He is the way that God has come to us and revealed himself. He is the embodiment of immanence, of God's nearness. So Jacob, when he wakes up, when he realizes what has happened here, he says, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. He is filled with fear, and he is sort of overcome with the awesomeness of this experience, with the glory of God. How awesome is this place, he says. This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Jacob knows that God is there. God has been in this place, and he's had this encounter. Just like Isaiah in the throne room of God, in his vision, he becomes aware, I am not worthy. We know from what we hear as God talks with Moses, no one can see the face of God and live. Jacob has this sense of, I have encountered the holy, and I've just done all this. As Emily said, he's running from God, and here God is, and I am in trouble. But that's not what happens, right? God didn't strike him down with a lightning bolt. God didn't promise him curses because of what he has done and because of his wickedness. God has promised presence and blessing and gift upon gift. Indeed, Jacob experiences grace here at Bethel. And we see that it is really not about his faithfulness, but about God's faithfulness. And so even though I do not like the character of Jacob, I am incredibly grateful for his place in this story and for all the characters in the Bible who get it wrong and who mess up and who fail to live out what God has asked them to do or to live according to God's path, because they remind us of God's grace, of God's forgiveness, of God's purposes that cannot be thwarted, and of how God uses broken, sinful, fallible human beings. And Jacob is another character who reminds us that God can use anyone, even this schemer who cheats his brother. God's promises and God's goodness go beyond our character, they go beyond our worthiness, and so the usurper inherits the promise. Now Jacob has deceived his father and his brother, and he's taken Esau's birthright and his blessing. But he's not the only one who has wandered. Who's wandered from God's path, who's wandered from the right way to live. And my question, my uncomfortable question for each of us here today is, how have you wandered? What are you watching? What do you do when no one is looking? What's your thought life like? Have you been angry, impatient, spoken harsh and unkind words? Is your voice hoarse from all the yelling? Are there actions you know are displeasing to God? Addictions you can't break free of? The God who meets Jacob, trickster, can and will meet you. God is with you, however you have wandered. Our first reading this morning came from Psalm 51, and that's a psalm of David written after David's sin with Bathsheba. And David is pouring out his heart to God in confession. Restore me, cleanse me, bring me back, God. And indeed, God does. Scripture calls David a man after God's own heart. That sin, that incident with Bathsheba, is not the end of David's relationship with God or the ways God will use David. He is restored because David recognizes his sin. He recognizes his wandering, and he turns away from it, and he turns towards God, and he repents and confesses, and God restores. Come home, just as David did. So we see God's grace here. We see God's grace for Jacob, and we see God's grace for us. Jacob gets up and takes the rock that he had been sleeping on, and he sets it up as a memorial. He raises it as a pillar, so he's making this marker from it. And he pours oil upon it to consecrate it. This is an act of worship, and he worships God. And he gives the place a new name, Bethel, the house of God. And so what had been no place in particular, just a place on the side of the road where he stopped for the night because it was dark, it now becomes some place very special, a place inhabited by God himself. But consider this. God was not there because the place was holy. The place was holy because God was there. Let me say that again. God was not there because the place was holy. The place was holy because God was there. And any place can be a place where we meet God because God is everywhere. We need only have eyes to see and a heart to listen. Maybe you know the old praise chorus, this is holy ground, we're standing on holy ground. Because God is here, and where he is holy ground. This is holy ground, we're standing on holy ground. we can meet God anywhere, even here. Any place can become the house of God. Later in the story, after Jacob has been through quite a lot, and the trickster himself has been tricked by his uncle Laban and suffered under his hand for 20 years, God tells Jacob to return home. But Jacob is worried that Esau is still angry with him and that he might try to harm him. And so he sends the women and the children away and he sends gifts ahead to sort of soothe Esau. And finally, the brothers meet after 2 decades of separation and hatred. And we wait to see whether Esau will kill him. I'm telling you about the soap opera business. Just read Genesis 25 to 35. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him, and he threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. After a whole childhood of living as enemies and 2 decades of living as strangers, now they are brothers. And Jacob makes one of the great statements of Scripture. To see your face is like seeing the face of God. Because once you meet God at Bethel, once you see God in an ordinary moment at an ordinary place, you never know where he'll show up next. You could start seeing him anywhere, even in the face of someone who's been your mortal enemy for 20 years. In the words of John Ortberg, God is closer than you think. Not only is the place transformed in this encounter, from Luz to Bethel, the house of God, Jacob is also transformed. This encounter with God has sometimes been described as the moment of his conversion. Up to this point, we would not describe Jacob as a godly man or as in any way pious. And it will be the end of the work God needs to do, but it is going to be the start of the journey. He'll still have a way to go. It'll still take some more time and some more hardship to bring him into a closer relationship with God, but this is the beginning. The blessing that Jacob tricked his father to receive, God now gives him for himself. The God of Abraham and Isaac will be his God too. Then Jacob makes a vow, which sounds a lot like bargaining to me. It sounds a lot like Jacob being Jacob. But Dr. Ralph Wilson says this is not so much bargaining as the nature of vows at the time, as it lays out what's expected of both parties. So I'll take that into consideration. So Jacob makes this vow, and he asks for God's presence and protection and provision and return to his father's house, and he promises him in return that he will worship God exclusively. You will be my God. That this pillar will be your house. This will be a place of worship. And he adds, I'm going to give 1/10 of my income to you, God, as a tithe. So Dr. Ralph Wilson also lifts up that the tithe of 1/10 of your income is the amount that a subject would give to their king. And so he says that in this action, Jacob is actually acknowledging Yahweh as king and pledging his allegiance to him. And that was something new I hadn't heard before, and it just fits with this image as a point of turning, a point of conversion in Jacob's life. Though it's not the end of the journey, it's the beginning of his walk with God and this relationship with God that has been his ancestors, his grandfather and his father's, is now his. So the question for us is whether or not we have had this kind of encounter and this kind of change and this kind of turnaround. Is the faith that we're walking in and we're practicing really because our parents raised us in the faith or our grandparents raised us in the faith, or is it our own faith? Is it something we've claimed and trusted for ourselves? Have we experienced God in a way that changes us, in a way that redirects our life? And do we acknowledge God as King of our lives? Later in his life, Jacob will look back and he'll see how God has been faithful. He'll wrestle with God, he'll receive a blessing, and God's promises in his life will be reaffirmed and deepened. But here is where it all begins. Here is where Jacob, the trickster, the wanderer, experiences grace. Here is where Jacob realizes that God God is not just in certain places, God is everywhere. God is in this place. And any place can be holy. And we can realize this too. That your car, your office, your classroom, your pillow, which I hope is more comfortable than a rock, your dining room table, your favorite spot under the tree, the place in the pew that you always sit every week, God is there. Have you been changed? Will you look and will you listen? Will you practice the disciplines necessary to grow in your spiritual life so that you can grow in your capacity to experience God's presence? This is the invitation, that we would walk a life with God so that we too might be transformed into the house of God. Amen. I invite you to stand as we sing together hymn 839, Blessed Assurance.